Frogs, Birds and Squirrels. Paul Stephen Alexander in Taiwan. The phone rang right when Dr. Paul Stephen Alexander was leading a frog dissection class. It was his wife, Lucy. "I'm in labor," she cried. Paul dashed back home to bring Lucy to the hospital. The baby girl was the couple's fourth child and their firstborn in Taiwan. Paul Stephen Alexander dreamt of becoming a missionary since he was a young lad. He was living his dream when he received a doctorate in biology in 1958 and took on a teaching position at Donghai University. The family, Lucy, one girl, and two boys, moved with him from Indiana to Taichung, settling at the foot of Mount Dadu. The walk from Paul's office to the Alexander's house took only 5 minutes, but Lucy knew she didn't have to rush her cooking whenever Paul phoned home to announce that he's done for the day. "Your father called. Supper in an hour," she would tell her children. The walk usually took longer than expected because Paul would bump into a colleague, a fellow missionary, or one of his students on the way. A quiet man of few words, Paul attended to these troubled friends by listening. By the time Paul was actually coming home, Lucy would ask the children to set the table. The kids were taught to prepare an additional set of fork and knife because whoever met Paul on his way home often ended up invited. Lucy and Paul opened their home to those in need. If a missionary couple had to be away and were unable to watch over their children, then they could send the young ones to Aunt Lucy's for a sleepover. If one needed space to host a youth Bible study group, a missionaries gathering, or a dormitory keepers fellowship, Paul's dining room might be ideal. No wonder when the Alexanders were renovating their house, Lucy specifically asked the designer to make the new dining room as spacious and comfortable as possible. Paul did take Mandarin lessons, but he was still more at ease lecturing in English. It was rather challenging for the students. The flip side was that, for the same reason, they had access to the latest developments in biology. Aware that his students might have difficulty understanding him, Paul would stay around after classes to help them catch up. He made sure that he knew every one of them. He recorded their names as pronounced in Mandarin and played the tape again and again until he could memorize them all. There were many instances of him calling out to someone in public, and it turned out that the person was in his class dozens of years ago. One day, a number of Paul's students were at his house doing a group project. Supper time over, the countless frogs outside began to croak. "Let's go get some lab subjects," Paul suggested. The Alexander children took a bucket, put on galoshes, and went out with their father and the undergrads, who were like big brothers and sisters to them. The captured frogs were kept in the bathtub. However, the children had already forgotten this when they came home from school the next day. One left the bathroom door open and frog by frog leaped out. "Ah!" Lucy screamed. The merry children whirled around in the house to chase the amphibians back. Thus, the younger Alexanders were quite used to the presence of guests and frogs at home. Newly laid eggs occupied the warmest corner in the house. When they hatched, the tadpoles were moved to the small water tank on the tea table. You may also find metamorphosing froglets in a covered plastic box upon the bookshelf. Paul's animals never failed to intrigue the children. He brought a sack home once. It was bound very tight, and something long was wriggling within. "Must be a snake," the children reasoned. Soon Paul took the sack to his office and casually laid it down. His secretary eyed the sack for a while and turned to him. It wouldn't be the first time the professor came in with fascinating acquisitions. "Snake," Paul said. She jumped up from her chair. The other time, rats that Paul had his students catch on Ali-san almost escaped from the cage, terrorizing the poor secretary. The front and backyards of the Alexanders served as a compact-sized zoo, with every kind from poultry, dogs, to goats. The next-door farmer's cow would put its head through the fence sometimes, upon which Lucy and Paul would hail to it, "Well, have some hay." The children wanted to keep a horse. Lucy and Paul assented to the idea on the condition that the children buy the animal with their own allowances, and that they take responsibility for feeding and walking it. The children held their end of the bargain. They got up early every day to ride or walk the horse on the Donghai campus before going to school. Frogs were Paul's primary research topic, but it came to his attention that Taiwan is home to a lot of birds, and that many migratory species stop over here. The welfare of birds in Taiwan became something he increasingly cared about. One time, he got wind of a woodland in Miaoli being cut down. The area was an egret habitat. Many hatchlings lost their nests and risked dying in the wild. Paul took some blankets and drove a jeep over 50 miles away to save as many as he could. He went back and forth several times and took home 30 egrets. He kept them in the backyard. The dependable children helped feed the little birds and monitor the temperature until they fledged and learned to fly. That egret episode was the last the Alexander family went through as a whole. In August 1965, a month after the birds flew away, Lucy and Paul's eldest boy got ill and departed for heaven. Another month later, the younger son had an accident and joined his brother. The boys were 10 and 8 at the time. "Taiwan became the land you buried your sons. Why don't you return to the States?" someone asked. "We shall stay here for the forests and mountains, for the students, and for what God willed me to do in the first place," Paul replied. A little more than a year later, Lucy and Paul's third daughter was born. The Alexanders also took in and eventually adopted Gladys Aylward's foster son after the small woman had passed away. Lucy would sometimes stop while going through her never-ending errands on the campus to look at the squirrels on the Formosan acacias. The red-bellied cuties were brought there to breed by Paul and his students for scientific purposes. From an initial colony of 24, they had become permanent residents of the university. The children chasing after squirrels in the woods would scare the birds away. They ran all the way to Paul's office. "Pa, he's not in the office. Where is he?" Paul had taken his students out to the field to watch birds of passage. They hoped to encounter some individuals they caught, tagged, and released in the past. There were no sightings that whole day. Well, a non-observation still a subject makes. Paul, ever patient, told the class. Let's ask ourselves, why is there no bird to be seen today? Come to think of it, Lucy, Paul, and their children did go through much in life, and they persevered in Taiwan, still marching on.